Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown.
I don't scare easy, and I grew up camping, so I'm not the type to post about shadows and swear they were demons. I'm a father mid-30s, the kind of person who overpacks first aid and argues about proper food storage. Last August, I took my family, my wife, our 15-year-old son, and our 9-year-old daughter to Blue Water Lake State Park in western New Mexico. It's about 30 miles west of Grants, not far off Interstate 40. We'd been there once before for a day trip and liked the quiet. The kind of quiet that feels earned, away from the constant hum of civilization. This time we booked a site for 2 nights on the northern loop, close to the water but not right on it. The plan was simple: fish in the morning, swim in the afternoon, cook on the fire, and get my kids off screens for a weekend. Something wholesome, something normal. When we checked in, a park employee in a green uniform told me our site would be really quiet. He said it like it was either a plus or a warning, his eyes lingering on mine for just a moment too long. The pause after his words hung there, and I almost asked him what he meant. But my wife was already pulling out the confirmation printout and my daughter was tugging at my shirt, asking when we could see the lake. I figured he meant we wouldn't be jammed between big RVs with generators running all night. That's what I told myself. We drove the loop, past a few scattered tents, and found ours tucked behind a few low trees and scrub. A narrow path cut down toward the lake through brittle grass that crunched under our shoes. You could see boats out on the water in the distance, small aluminum rigs with outboard motors, and a couple of kayaks cutting lazy paths across the surface. The sky was a clear, endless blue, and it felt like every family should have a day like that. I'll say this up front: the place is beautiful in the daylight. Almost aggressively beautiful, the kind of landscape that makes you forget cities exist. The air tasted clean, though with that high desert dryness that makes your lips crack if you're not careful. Heat radiated up from the packed earth, and the sun felt closer than it should, more personal. We set up without trouble. I hammered steaks while my wife unrolled sleeping bags with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this dozens of times. Our son, let's call him Miguel, spent a good half hour skipping rocks with decent form, his thin frame silhouetted against the water. Our daughter, Sophia, collected chalky, sun-bleached stones along the trail and lined them up on a flat rock like a museum display, narrating their imagined histories in that way 9-year-olds do, where every object becomes precious. The smell out there is familiar if you've spent time in the Southwest. Sage, dry dirt, hot sun mixed with something mineral and ancient. A raven flapped overhead once, its shadow passing over our tent, and that was the loudest thing we heard all afternoon. Even Miguel's rock skipping seemed muted, the splashes absorbed by the vastness of the lake and sky. There isn't much to complain about at Blue Water Lake when the sun is high. The heat is honest, the land is open, and you can see trouble coming from a mile away. It's the darkness I should have thought about more carefully. Around 6, the breeze died off and the heat settled into that particular stillness that comes before evening, where the air feels suspended. We drove to the little store in Grants for ice and snacks. The kind of small convenience store with a handwritten sign and a bell that jingles when you open the door. The woman behind the counter smiled at Sophia when she picked out candy, but I noticed she didn't make eye contact with me. On the way back, we took NM 612 from the south, the road that angles in toward the park entrance through miles of nothing but scrub and telephone poles. The kids were quiet in the back, the way kids get when they're worn out from the sun and fresh air. I remember thinking I'd sleep like a rock. That deep camping sleep where your body remembers it's an animal and shuts down completely. We ate hot dogs and beans cooked over the fire, cleaned up, and were in the tent by 10:30. I set the cooler in the shade, stashed trash in the car with the doors locked, and latched the windows on the SUV. Routine stuff. The kind of evening ritual that feels safe because you've done it 100 times. I even joked with my wife about whether we'd see shooting stars, though neither of us stayed up long enough to look. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the sound of Sophia's breathing evening out. That soft rhythm that tells you a child has surrendered to sleep. I woke up the first time around 12:20 a.m. I know because I checked my watch, the illuminated numbers glowing green in the darkness. The tent was warm and still, the air inside thick with the smell of sleeping bags and the faint sweetness of Sophia's strawberry shampoo. My wife was on her side facing away from me, her breathing slow and steady. On the other side of the tent, the kids had rolled toward each other in their bags and made a pile of limbs, the way siblings do even when they claim to hate sharing space. I lay there listening to the absolute quiet. No motor from the lake, no wheels on gravel, no distant voices. Just air and the slight rustle of nylon when I shifted position. The silence was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I've camped in remote places before, the Rockies, the Cascades, even a week in Alaska where the darkness stretched for 20 hours. But this felt different. This felt expectant. Something about the quality of the silence made me aware of my own heartbeat, the rush of blood in my ears. I told myself it was the altitude, or the heat still trapped in the tent, or just the strangeness of the first night in a new place. Your body needs time to adjust, to learn what sounds are normal. I fell asleep again without thinking much about it, though some part of me remained aware, hovering just below consciousness like I was waiting for something. The second time I woke, it was because something stepped close to the tent, not rustling. This was weight on dirt, the unmistakable compression of earth under something heavy. One step, then nothing. A pause that stretched too long. I held my breath and waited for the next one, my body going rigid. My heart knocked around for a few seconds, that immediate animal response before your mind catches up and tries to rationalize. I told myself it was a raccoon, or maybe one of the stray dogs that wander through parks sometimes. I've had bears push around cook boxes in Colorado. They're huffing and snuffling so close I could smell them through the tent. I've had elk walk right through campsites in Utah, their hooves like drums on the hard ground. You learn when to intervene and when to let an animal pass. You learn the difference between curious and aggressive. I kept still and listened. Another step, slow, deliberate, like a person taking care not to make sound. Not the random wandering of an animal, but something methodical. The weight was wrong too. Heavier than a dog, distributed differently than a deer. I sat up and unzipped the sleeping bag as quietly as I could, the sound of the zipper absurdly loud in the silence. My wife's hand found my leg in the dark, her fingers cold and tight. I could feel the question in her grip. I told her quietly it was probably nothing, that I was going to look, trying to keep my voice level and calm. I didn't want the kids to wake up to me crawling around in a panic. Fear is contagious, especially in the dark, especially in confined spaces. I grabbed the flashlight from my shoe where I always keep it, feeling the familiar weight of it in my palm. I took a breath, lifted the flap and stepped out in my socks. The air outside felt wrong. It was warmer than it should be at 2 in the morning in August, close, a little stale, like air that had been breathed already. The stars were out but seemed dimmer than before, or maybe my eyes hadn't adjusted yet. I clicked on the light. The circle caught the nearest tree trunks, their bark pale and peeling. The beam swept across our picnic table, the cooler sitting beside it, an empty space above the dirt where moths should have been swarming. I traced the beam in a slow half circle, my thumb resting on the button, ready to turn it off if I needed to hide. The light hit something standing by the tree line. It looked like my son. Every detail screamed familiarity. He was 25 feet away, just past the edge of our sight where the ground drops toward the trail to the water. The face, the hair, the height. The way he stood with his weight slightly on one leg. That teenage slouch I was always telling him to correct. It was close enough that my brain filled in the details automatically and said, "That's your kid. He's sleepwalking. Go get him." Except behind me, inside the tent, I could hear Miguel's steady breathing, and I could see two shapes pressed against the nylon, both kids exactly where they should be. The math didn't work, but my eyes kept insisting, kept trying to make sense of something that wore my son's body like borrowed clothes. I raised the light higher on purpose, straight into the face. Miguel has a small scar on his right eyebrow from a skateboard fall 3 years ago, a thin white line he's self-conscious about. The thing had it too, but not exactly. It was too centered, too symmetrical, like a copy made from a description rather than from life. The skin around it looked stretched, pulled too tight over the bones beneath. The texture was wrong, too smooth, almost waxy in the beam of the flashlight. And it blinked. If you want to know what reset my thinking from sleep mode to full danger, it was the blink. The eyelids moved up instead of down. Bottom to top smooth, with no eyelash flutter, No reflex squint, no moisture. Just this mechanical lift of skin that revealed the whites of the eyes, too white, too clean, like fresh paper. The mouth was slightly open, and every few seconds it opened wider without the jaw hinging the way it should. The movement was wrong, too smooth, like watching something melt and reform. The light didn't make it squint. People flinch when a bright light goes in their eyes at night. It's involuntary, protective, human. This didn't. It just stood there, absorbing the light. The pupils not contracting, the face not moving except for that awful mouth opening and closing. "Miguel," I said, testing the name in a level voice. Not loud, not a challenge, just his name. The word felt strange in my mouth, like I was calling to something I knew wasn't him but couldn't name. Nothing. No response, no acknowledgement. The face didn't change expression. I took a small step to my right to angle the beam, to see if it would track me, to see if it had normal reflexes. It rotated toward me, slow, mechanically smooth, like someone learning how to move shoulders. The arms hung straight, too straight, fingertips not curling the way human hands do at rest. The posture was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Too perfect, too still, like a mannequin or a photograph. Nothing about it suggested warmth or blood or breath. I picked up a rock from the ground because I needed the world to act like the world. I needed cause and effect, action and reaction. I lobbed it into the dirt near its feet. Not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough to provoke a response. The rock bounced and skittered across the packed earth, the sound sharp in the quiet. It didn't react. Not a flinch, not a glance down, not a single muscle twitch. It just kept staring at me with those wrong eyes and that hanging open mouth. That's when fear flattened everything. I don't mean panic. I mean clarity with an edge. The way time seems to slow and sharpen when your brain realizes you're in actual danger. My arms prickled with gooseflesh despite the heat. My hearing became acute. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, the faint sound of my wife's breathing from inside the tent, the absence of normal night sounds. No crickets, no breeze, nothing. I remembered there's a knife in the cook box, a hatchet in the SUV, a whistle snapped to my backpack. None of those things mattered against something I couldn't categorize, something that stood outside the normal rules. What do you do when confronted with something that wears a familiar face but moves like something learning to be human? "You need to leave," I said, because that's what came out. My voice sounded thin and strange, absorbed by the air. The thing's head tilted slightly, and for a moment I thought it was mimicking confusion. Then it took a step. The knee lifted too high, like it was stepping over something that wasn't there. The foot came down carefully, testing the ground, and then the weight shifted forward in a movement that was almost right but fundamentally wrong. Another step. Same odd motion, like watching someone operate a body from the inside for the first time. Then it moved. 1 second it was slow and deliberate, and the next it ran into the trees in a straight line so fast I lost it at the edge of my light. No build-up, no acceleration, no panting or sound of exertion. Just gone. The only sound was brush moving apart and then snapping back together. Then everything was still again, more still than before, like the night was holding its breath. I stood there until my arm shook from holding the flashlight up, the beam wavering across empty space. I counted to 60 in my head, then did it again, straining to hear any sound of movement or breathing. Nothing came back. I turned off the light to save the battery, and because I suddenly didn't want to see what else might be out there, waiting at the edge of the beam, going back inside the tent felt like crawling into a trap. But staying outside felt worse. I zipped the flap carefully, my hands shaking, and sat down on my sleeping bag. My wife whispered, "What?" I told her I saw someone at the tree line, and that I probably scared them off, and that we'd pack at first light. I felt her hand grip my arm hard enough to hurt. I know what people will say. Wake the kids, get in the car, leave immediately. I thought about it. The problem is it takes time to get 2 kids into a vehicle when they're asleep and confused. You have to explain without causing panic. Find shoes in the dark, zip bags, collapse the tent, and the distance between the tent and the car felt like an exposed path, 40 feet of open ground. If that thing was still nearby, if it was watching, the safest place for the next few hours was a zip tent with the 4 of us together and me awake. So I sat there, light in my hand, and I watched the seam of the door until the gray of morning showed through the nylon. I never heard another step, but I swear I felt watched. That pressure of being observed, of being measured. My wife stayed awake too. I could tell from her breathing, from the tension in her body beside mine. We didn't speak. We just waited for the sun. The gray light of dawn was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. That gradual shift from black to blue to pale gray. The way shapes emerged from shadow and became ordinary again. Trees were just trees. Dirt was just dirt. But my body felt wrong. Adrenaline sick and hollow, muscles cramping from hours of frozen stillness. We didn't talk much while we packed. That's not bravado. That's focus. That's two parents operating on the same frequency of fear and determination. My wife rolled sleeping bags with mechanical efficiency while I took down poles. Every sound made me turn a bird call, the rustle of something small in the brush, even the wind picking up with the sunrise. I told the kids we were leaving early to beat heat in crowds, trying to keep my voice light. There was no argument. Miguel moved slower than usual, like he'd been hit with a heavy workout the day before, his movements stiff and deliberate. He kept looking at the trees with a blank expression I couldn't read. Sophia, who almost always hums when she's happy, was quiet in a way that worried me more than questions would have. I had to go back to the rock where we'd lined up Sophia's stone collection, because she wanted to take 2 of them home. I wasn't thrilled about extending our time by even 30 seconds. But I walked over, my wife's eyes tracking me the whole way. Standing there, bent down to pick up the smooth stone Sophia had chosen, I realized why the hair on my arms lifted again. There were 2 sets of footprints in the powdery dirt at the edge of camp. Mine from the night. I could tell by the pattern of my boot, the weight distribution, and another set that matched Miguel's shoe tread closely but not perfectly. The spacing was off, longer than a 15-year-old's natural stride. The toe-off marks were too shallow for the length of stride, like something mimicking walking without understanding the mechanics of human movement. I crouched down and measured one print with my hand. The detail was extraordinary. You could see the pattern of wear on the sole, the small nick in the left shoe from when Miguel had kicked a curb, but the depth was wrong. Too light in some places, too heavy in others, like a map of footprints rather than the actual thing. I looked at the trees and saw nothing but morning light filtering through branches. But I felt that presence again, that weight of observation. I grabbed the stones and walked back quickly, not quite running but close. We had everything in the car in less than 10 minutes. The kids were buckled in the back, my wife in the passenger seat with her hands gripping her knees. I was just turning the key when Miguel said, "Dad." His voice had a flatness I don't hear often. Not fear, not even emotion, just this hollow quality that made my stomach drop. He was looking toward the same trees. Past the trunks, standing half in shadow where the morning light hadn't quite reached, was the face again. It was closer this time, maybe 15 feet from where our tent had been, in a spot that had been empty seconds before. The jaw hung open wider than before, the angle wrong, not hinged at the point a human jaw stops. I could see the throat, or what should have been a throat, just darkness inside, like looking into a well. The eyes didn't water, didn't react to the light filtering through the trees or the cooler morning air. It didn't move. It didn't breathe visibly. That might sound like a small detail, but when you're close to something that looks human, you expect to see the chest rise, the throat shift, the micro movements that signal life. This was still as a photograph, but somehow I knew it was watching us. Miguel's hand closed on the handle of the door, like he couldn't decide whether to step out or slam it shut. Some part of him recognized what he was seeing, even if his conscious mind rejected it. I said his name and told him to look at me, sharp and urgent. He did, pulling his eyes away with visible effort. When we looked back, it was gone. No branches moved, no sound carried, no footprints appeared in the dirt, just empty space where something had been standing. The absence felt deliberate, performative, like it wanted us to know it could disappear at will. I started the car and pulled onto the loop road, my hands tight on the wheel. The drive out felt longer than it should, every curve revealing nothing but empty pavement and scrub. I watched the mirror for a mile, looking for movement, for something keeping pace with us through the trees. There was nothing behind us but a strip of gray asphalt in bright morning sunlight, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched until we hit the main road. My wife's hands were braced on her knees, knuckles white. She didn't say a word until we hit the junction for Interstate 40. Then she said, "We're not going back there." Not a question, a statement of fact. I agreed without hesitation. Sophia said, Was that thing Miguel? From the back seat, her voice small and confused. My wife and I exchanged a look. I didn't want to lie, but I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen in terms a 9-year-old could process. No, baby, my wife said. That was something else. Something that didn't belong there. Why did it look like him? Sophia pressed. I don't know, I said, which was the truth. Miguel stayed quiet, staring out the window, his reflection pale in the glass. We passed the exit for the El Moro area and the signs for Gallup and Grants. The landscape opened up, the claustrophobia of the trees giving way to the broad sweep of desert. The kids were both looking out opposite windows like they were expecting to see something keeping pace with us over the scrub, matching our speed, following us home. We stopped for gas in Grants at a combination gas station and small store. One of those places that feels frozen in time. I went inside for coffee and to breathe in conditioned air for a minute. To feel fluorescent lights and hear the hum of refrigerators, normal sounds from the normal world. The clerk was an older man with a gray mustache and weathered skin that spoke of decades under the desert sun. He glanced out at my SUV, at the cooler tied down and the rolled tent visible through the glass. Camping? He asked. Yeah, I said. Blue water. He nodded once and said, good fishing sometimes. Not when you leave at dawn, I said, trying to make light of it. My voice sounded thin even to my own ears. I added, because I needed to say it, because keeping it inside felt like poison. We were in the northern loop, quiet spot. He looked at me for a second like he recognized something he'd seen before. His expression shifted from casual to something more careful. That side gets weird, he said finally, the word hanging in the air between us. You all right? We're fine, I said. We just. I stopped because I didn't know how to finish that sentence. We just saw something that shouldn't exist. We just encountered something wearing my son's face. None of it sounded real in the harsh fluorescent light. He reached under the counter and pulled out a pack of coffee stirrers and set them down. Maybe just for something to do with his hands. When he looked up at me again, his eyes were serious. Couple years back, he said, lower now. Fisherman packed up in the middle of the night. Left his gear, his food, everything. Came in here at dawn swearing he saw himself standing by the trees. Kept saying the eyes were wrong. Said they blinked wrong. My blood went cold. No. I felt my chest tighten. My breathing go shallow. What do you mean? Blinked wrong. He couldn't explain it right. Just said it was backwards. Or inside out. Or something. Kept touching his own face like he needed to make sure he was still himself. The clerk paused. Folks around here talk about things they don't want to give power to by naming. You might hear them say other words, but I don't use them. I can't tell you what you saw, but you did the right thing leaving. What happened to the fisherman? I asked. Moved away. Didn't come back. He rang up the coffee. Some places are older than us. Some things were here first. We're just passing through their territory, and mostly they don't care. But sometimes, he trailed off, shaking his head. I didn't correct him or ask for his version. I paid and walked back to the car. The coffee hot in my hand, but my fingers still cold. My wife met my eyes in that brief moment parents have when they speak without saying words. When you communicate fear and determination and love all at once. I told the kids we'd get breakfast in an hour, and that they could pick any place they wanted. Sophia asked if we were going to camp somewhere else. I said, not today, maybe not for a while. We got home early in the afternoon and unloaded fast, almost frantically. The normalcy of our neighborhood, the mailbox, the familiar houses, the sound of a lawnmower felt overwhelming in its ordinariness. How could this world exist alongside what we'd seen? How could both be real? The tent stayed in the garage for a week because I couldn't bring myself to set it up in the yard and wash it down. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the sound of footsteps in the dirt, the wrongness of that face in my flashlight beam. Little things set me off those first few days. A jacket hanging on a door that looked for just a second like someone standing there. My son taking a few seconds too long to answer when I called his name from another room. Those seconds stretching into eternity before I heard his voice. The way shadows fell in the hallway at night. The sound of footsteps on the stairs that stopped and started with odd rhythm. My brain kept replaying the eyelids moving the wrong direction. That smooth, mechanical lift from bottom to top. I'd be doing something normal. Washing dishes, reading a report, driving. And the image would flash across my mind with perfect clarity. The stretched skin around the copied scar, the two white eyes, the jaw opening too wide. I tried to find an explanation I could live with. A person messing with us, but why? And how did they disappear so completely? Drugs. But I hadn't smelled anything, and the movements were too purposeful. A mask. But masks don't move like that. Don't blink like that. Don't run like that. The speed from motionless to gone, and the absence of normal reflexes wrecked those theories. Some nights I'd lie awake running through the logic, trying to find the crack in my perception that would let reality back in. Maybe I'd been half asleep. Maybe my mind had filled in details that weren't there. Maybe the stress of work and family had created a hallucination so vivid it felt real. But then I'd remember my wife had been awake too. Miguel had seen it. The footprints had been there in the dirt, physical and measurable. Miguel changed after that trip. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would show up on a report card. But I noticed. He started checking the windows at night before bed, making sure they were locked. He began sleeping with his door cracked open so the hall light came through. He stopped wanting to go anywhere isolated. When his friends suggested hiking or camping, he always had an excuse. One night about 2 weeks after we got back, I found him in the kitchen at 2 a.m., just standing there in the dark. Couldn't sleep, he said when I turned on the light. His eyes looked haunted, older than 15. "Do you want to talk about what we saw?" I asked. He shook his head. Then, after a long pause, "Do you think it's still there?" "I don't know," I said, which was honest. "But it's not here. It's not following us." "How do you know?" I didn't have an answer for that. "Because we're okay," I said finally. "We're home. We're safe." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't quite believe me. I'm not sure I believed myself. Sophia started having nightmares. She'd wake up crying, saying she dreamed about faces that looked wrong, about people who stood too still. My wife would hold her and I'd sit on the edge of the bed, and we'd wait for her breathing to even out. We never talked about Blue Water Lake in front of the kids, but they knew. They'd lived through it too. My wife and I agreed on that in the car without saying it, that silent communication that comes from years together. We haven't been back to Blue Water Lake. We still camp, but not there, and not near that kind of tree line, isolated, dense, the kind where you can't see past the first row of trunks. We choose sites closer to ranger stations now, places with families nearby, lots of noise and light. I don't keep this to myself in some mystical way. When friends talk about camping in New Mexico, I tell them to pick other sites and other parks. If they insist on Blue Water Lake, I tell them to choose a spot closer to other families, preferably on the southern loop. I tell them to leave if anything feels off, even if it's just one wrong step in the dirt at 2 in the morning. Most people laugh it off, think I'm being paranoid, or trying to scare them. But occasionally someone hears something in my voice and takes me seriously. They nod slowly and ask what I saw. I tell them plain and simple, without embellishment. A face that looked like my son but wasn't. Movement that wasn't human. Eyes that blinked the wrong way. They usually go quiet after that. I've done research since then, carefully, not wanting to fall down conspiracy rabbit holes but needing to know if anyone else had seen what we saw. You find things, if you look. Forum posts from people who swear they encountered something similar, archived news articles about abandoned campsites, vague references in local history to places where people avoid camping even when the spot looks perfect. There's a thread that runs through a lot of the accounts. The mimic quality. The way these things, whatever they are, wear familiar faces. Like they're trying to understand us by copying our shapes, but they don't quite get it right. The mechanics are wrong. The soul is missing. It's uncanny valley made flesh, or whatever passes for flesh. Every August, when the nights hold heat later than they should, and air sits heavy after midnight, I remember the quiet of that campsite. The beam of light. The face at the tree line that blinked from the bottom up. The sound of footsteps that were too deliberate, too measured. The speed of something moving between stillness and motion without the transition. I don't know what to call it beyond what locals call it. Those who've been in the area long enough to know there are things that don't have proper names. I'm not interested in chasing it or proving anything. I don't want to go back and gather evidence. I don't want photographs or recordings. I wanted a simple weekend away with my family, and I got a clear line I won't cross again. The thing is, life goes on. We camp in other places, make new memories, watch the kids grow. Miguel is starting to think about college now. Sophia is into basketball, all elbows and energy. My wife and I plan trips, shorter ones, safer ones. We grill in the backyard and tell ourselves this is enough, and mostly it is. But sometimes, late at night when everyone else is asleep, I think about that moment when the thing ran into the trees. The impossible speed, the way it moved in a straight line like physics didn't apply. I think about what it wanted, why it was there, what would have happened if I'd stepped closer or called out to it differently. I think about the footprints in the dirt that matched my son's shoes but weren't made by his weight. I think about the way it studied me, head tilted, learning. I think about all the people who've camped in that spot since. All the families who've set up their tents in that quiet site on the northern loop. I wonder if they've seen anything. I wonder if it's still there, waiting at the edge of the light, practicing its human movements, getting better at the mimicry. The park is still open. People still camp there. The reviews online are mostly good. Beautiful sunsets, great fishing, peaceful nights. A few mention feeling watched, or hearing footsteps, or seeing shadows that move wrong. But those are easy to dismiss. Every isolated place has stories. Every dark stretch of forest generates fear. What I know for certain is this. There are things that live in the spaces we don't control, in the wild places we visit but don't truly understand. Most of the time we pass through without incident. We take our pictures, cook our meals, and go home with nothing but good memories. But sometimes, rarely, we encounter something that reminds us we're not the only ones out there. If you camp at Blue Water Lake on the Northern Loop, and you wake to heavy steps and a shape at the edge of your sight that looks like someone you know, don't talk to it. Don't try to get a closer look. Don't test it or challenge it. Wake your family, be calm, and leave in the morning. Don't run. That might trigger something, but don't stay either. That's not fear talking. That's respect for something that was there before we were, and doesn't care if we believe in it. That's acknowledgement that the world is bigger and stranger than we like to admit. That's a father protecting his family, the only way he knows how, by sharing what he learned so others don't have to learn it themselves. I still have the stones Sophia picked up that morning, the ones I retrieved while standing over those wrong footprints. They sit on a shelf in my garage, ordinary rocks from an ordinary place. Sometimes I pick one up and feel the weight of it, solid and real. I remind myself that what happened was real too, that I'm not crazy, that my family saw what I saw. And then I put the rock back and close the garage door and go inside where the lights are bright and my family is safe and the world makes sense again. Until the next August when the heat sits heavy after midnight and I remember the quiet and the light and the face that blinked wrong. We survived. We learned. We left. That's all you can do sometimes. Learn where the lines are, and don't cross them. Know when you're in a place that doesn't belong to you, and respect what was there first. And if something stands at the edge of your campsite wearing a face you recognize but don't quite believe, trust your instincts and leave. Because some things don't have explanations. Some experiences don't fit into the world we've built with science and reason and comfortable certainties. And that's okay. You don't have to understand everything. You don't have to prove anything. You just have to survive it, and keep your family safe and know when to walk away. That's what I did. That's what I'm telling you to do if you ever find yourself in a similar situation. Listen to that ancient part of your brain that knows when something is wrong, that recognizes threat, even when it comes wearing a familiar face. Trust yourself, trust your fear, and leave before you learn what happens to people who stay. I'm a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'll just call it BJJ. It's a grappling martial art mainly used in MMA and in the UFC. It's the combination of using leverage and technique to beat bigger and stronger opponents. Now I won't bore you with the history of BJJ, but I can tell you this, it changed my life in ways I never expected. I love it. It's one of the few things that actually makes me happy. In a world where most people drift through their days in a fog of routine and numbness, BJJ gives me clarity. It forces you to be present, to think, to move, to survive. You can't fake it on the mats. Either you know what you're doing, or you don't. Either you can escape that chokehold, or you tap out. It's honest in a way that most things in life aren't. I've competed in some grappling tournaments, but nothing big. Local stuff, mostly. A few medals here and there. More losses than I'd like to admit, but that's part of the journey. Every time you lose, you learn. Every time someone passes your guard or sinks in a submission you didn't see coming, you walk away with a lesson. That's what I told myself, anyway. Now BJJ has surpassed traditional martial arts like karate and taekwondo for self-defense and fitness purposes. Many companies and martial arts schools now incorporate BJJ into their curriculums. It's a worldwide phenomenon, often hailed as the most effective martial art in the world, and I intended to stick with it as long as I could. The belt system progresses from white belt to blue, purple, brown, black, and ultimately red. I'd been training for 5 years when I earned my purple belt. It felt like a significant achievement, though I knew I was still far from mastery. My teacher, Warren, was a black belt with 15 years of experience. He ran his own school in a renovated warehouse on the industrial side of town. The place smelled like sweat and rubber mats, and I loved it. Warren was the kind of instructor who pushed you beyond what you thought you could do. He was in his early 40s, built like someone who'd spent decades perfecting his body as a weapon. Not bulky, but dense, compact. When he demonstrated a technique, every movement was precise, economical, nothing wasted. He could make a chokehold look like poetry. It was a Tuesday evening, after a particularly brutal training session, when Warren announced his plan. We were all sitting on the edge of the mats, drenched in sweat, catching our breath. "I want to organize something different," Warren said, pacing in front of us. "A weekend camping trip. Get away from the city, train in nature, bond as a group, build that team mentality." The idea sounded good in theory. Fresh air, no distractions, focused training with our instructor. Several people seemed interested, asking questions about the location, the cost, what to bring. Warren had already scouted a spot, a forest area about 2 hours north, remote enough to feel isolated but still accessible by car. We'd leave Friday afternoon, spend 2 nights and return Sunday evening. He had the permits, he said. He'd organized everything. Over the next 2 weeks, the initial enthusiasm dwindled. People had work commitments, family obligations, or simply lost interest. By the time Friday arrived, only 4 students, including myself, were able to go. Warren was disappointed by the low turnout. I could see it in his face when we met at the school to carpool, but he proceeded with the trip anyway. "Small group means more personalized instruction," he said, trying to spin the situation positively. So there was me, Warren, Dominic, a brown belt with over 3 years of experience who was incredibly technical. Troy, a blue belt who relied more on athleticism than technique, and our newest member Felix, a white belt who'd been training for just 2 months. I didn't know Felix well. He'd joined the school recently, always quiet, always watching. He was in his late 20s, thin, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to absorb everything. He rarely spoke during class, just nodded when Warren corrected his form. There was something unsettling about his quietness, but I couldn't articulate what it was. When we embarked on the trip, I tried to shake off my unease. The sun was shining, the weather forecast looked good, and Warren's enthusiasm was infectious. Everything seemed promising for a great weekend. We arrived at the camping spot around 6 in the evening. The forest was dense, towering pines blocking out much of the remaining daylight. The air smelled of earth and decay, that rich scent of organic matter breaking down. Warren had chosen a clearing large enough for our tents, with a fire pit someone had built previously. We set up our tents and supplies methodically. Warren and Dominic worked together on one side of the clearing. Troy and Felix set up near the tree line. I positioned my tent close to the fire pit, thinking I'd want the warmth during the night. The evening began well enough. We built a fire as darkness settled over the forest. Warren had brought beer, and we passed bottles around, the flames casting flickering shadows across our faces. Someone played music from a portable speaker, nothing too loud, just background noise to fill the silence of the wilderness. Warren told stories from his past competitions, tales of close matches, devastating losses, unexpected victories. He'd traveled internationally for tournaments, trained with legends of the sport. Listening to him, I felt inspired and inadequate in equal measure. But as the night wore on, something shifted. The forest seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The trees surrounded us like walls, and beyond the circle of firelight, the darkness was absolute, complete. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, though I couldn't have said what I was looking for. Troy noticed it too. "It's really dark out here," he said, stating the obvious. "No light pollution," Warren replied. "That's the point. You city people forget what real darkness looks like." But it wasn't just the darkness. It was the silence. The forest had gone quiet. No insects chirping. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the crackle of our fire and our own voices, which seemed too loud in the stillness. Felix sat across the fire from me, barely visible in the dancing light. He hadn't said much all evening, just nursed his beer and watched. When the firelight caught his eyes, they reflected oddly, almost glowing. I told myself it was just the angle, the way the flames hit them. Around midnight, we began to retreat to our tents. Warren was the last to turn in, banking the fire so it would last through the night. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence outside. No wind, no animals, nothing. I didn't sleep well. Every small sound seemed amplified. The rustling of my sleeping bag sounded like thunder. At one point I thought I heard footsteps outside my tent, soft and deliberate, but when I listened harder, there was nothing. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, gray morning light was filtering through the tent fabric. Saturday morning arrived cold and damp. Mist hung between the trees, turning the forest into something from a nightmare. I unzipped my tent and emerged, my joints stiff from sleeping on the ground. Troy was already up, standing near the dead fire pit, rubbing his arms for warmth. "Morning," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Morning? Did you sleep okay?" He shrugged. "Not really. This place is creepy at night." Dominic emerged from his tent next, looking as unrested as I felt. Felix came out last, and I noticed something odd. He looked completely refreshed, like he'd spent the night in a 5-star hotel instead of a tent in the woods. We waited for Warren to emerge from his tent, but minutes passed and nothing happened. The tent remained zipped shut, silent. "Should we wake him?" Troy asked. Dominic frowned. "Warren's usually the first one up. He's big on discipline." More minutes passed. The silence from Warren's tent became unnerving. Finally, Dominic walked over and knocked on one of the poles. "Warren, you okay in there?" No response. Dominic knocked again, harder. "Warren?" Still nothing. He looked back at us, concern evident on his face. Then he reached for the zipper. The sound of it opening seemed obscenely loud in the morning stillness. Dominic stuck his head inside the tent. For a moment he was perfectly still. Then he stumbled backward, his face gone white, and vomited into the bushes. I don't remember running to the tent, but suddenly I was there, looking inside, and my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. Warren lay in his sleeping bag, his face purple and bloated. His eyes were open, bulging, shot through with burst blood vessels. His tongue protruded slightly from his mouth. Around his neck, the bruising was severe, showing clear finger marks. Someone had strangled him with their bare hands. But it was his expression that haunted me most. The look of shock frozen on his face. He hadn't just been killed. He'd been genuinely surprised by his attacker. Troy pushed past me to look, then backed away quickly. "God," he whispered. "Oh God." We stood there in shock, unable to move, unable to think. Warren, our black belt instructor, the most skilled fighter among us, had been choked to death in his sleep. The technique required to do that, to render someone unconscious without waking them, to continue applying pressure until death, was expert level. "We need to call the police," Troy said, his voice shaking. But Dominic held up his hand. "Wait, just wait. Let's think about this." "Think about what?" Troy's voice rose toward panic.
"He's dead! Someone killed him!"
"I know that," Dominic snapped. "But who? And why? We need to understand what happened before we bring in the authorities." I understood Dominic's hesitation, even if I didn't agree with it. Warren was a black belt, highly skilled in BJJ. For someone to overpower him, to choke him to death without a struggle loud enough to wake the rest of us, it didn't make sense. Unless the killer was someone Warren trusted, someone he wouldn't expect to attack him. We all looked at each other. There were only 4 of us, and one of us had killed Warren. Suspicions arose immediately, because some of us had left our tents during the night. I'd heard footsteps, hadn't I? Or had I dreamed it? Troy admitted he'd gotten up once to relieve himself. Dominic said he'd woken up several times but stayed in his tent. Felix said nothing, just watched us with those dark, absorbing eyes. "We should search the area," Dominic said. "Look for signs of an intruder. Before we call the police, we need to know if someone else was here." It was a thin rationalization, but we clung to it. The alternative that one of us was a murderer was too horrifying to accept. We split up to search the surrounding forest. I went east, Troy went west, Felix headed north, and Dominic circled the perimeter of our camp. We agreed to regroup in 30 minutes. The forest felt different in daylight, but no less oppressive. The mist hadn't burned off yet, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. I pushed through undergrowth, looking for what? Footprints, discarded weapons. I didn't even know. My mind raced as I walked. Warren had been strong, capable. For someone to choke him to death, they'd need significant skill, the kind of skill that takes years to develop. A white belt like Felix wouldn't have it. Troy was athletic, but technical knowledge was limited. Dominic had the skill, but did he have the motive? I realized I was trying to construct a theory where I wasn't the killer, which meant I was already accepting that one of us was guilty. 30 minutes later, I returned to camp. Troy was already there, pacing nervously. Felix arrived shortly after, emerging silently from the trees. But Dominic didn't come back. We waited 5 minutes, then 10. Troy called out Dominic's name, his voice echoing through the forest. No response. A terrible certainty settled over me. I didn't want to go looking, didn't want to find what I knew we would find, but we had no choice. We spread out again, this time staying within sight of each other, calling Dominic's name. It was Felix who found him. "Over here," Felix called out, his voice calm, too calm. Dominic was lying near his tent, partially hidden by the undergrowth. Like Warren, he'd been strangled. The bruising around his neck told the story. But unlike Warren, Dominic had clearly fought back. His hands were torn up, fingernails broken, defensive wounds on his forearms. He'd known his attacker was coming. He'd tried to defend himself, and it hadn't mattered. Troy fell to his knees and started hyperventilating. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. No service. Of course there was no service. Warren had chosen this spot specifically for its remoteness. "We need to get to the cars," I said. "Drive until we get signal. Call the police." When we regrouped, there were only 3 of us. Troy, Felix, and me. Our 2 best grapplers were dead, killed by someone with expert technique. Someone who was still among us. Troy and I decided to go for the cars together, leaving Felix at the camp. It was a risk either way. Leave him alone with the bodies, or bring him with us and leave the crime scene unattended. We chose the former, and I'll admit, part of me hoped he'd be gone when we returned. The drive down the mountain was a blur. Troy white-knuckled the steering wheel while I kept checking my phone for signal. It finally appeared about 20 minutes down the road, and I immediately called 911. The police showed up within an hour, along with an ambulance, and eventually crime scene investigators. We led them back to the camp, where Felix was sitting exactly where we'd left him, staring at nothing. The next several hours were a nightmare of questions. They separated us, interviewed us individually, took our statements. I told them everything I could remember. The sounds in the night, finding Warren's body, discovering Dominic. The detective handling the case was a woman in her 50s named Garrison. She had tired eyes that had seen too much. "You train in this martial art," she said to me. "Could you have overpowered your instructor?" "No," I said firmly. Warren was a black belt. He'd been training for 15 years. Even if I wanted to hurt him, I couldn't. "What about the brown belt? Dominic?" Same answer. He was better than me, more experienced. She made notes, her face unreadable. "What about the other 2 students? Troy's a blue belt. Athletic but not exceptionally skilled. And Felix just started training 2 months ago. He's a white belt. Could he have done this?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to say it was impossible for a beginner to kill 2 experienced grapplers. But something stopped me. Some instinct I couldn't name. "I don't know," I said finally. The investigation dragged on for hours. They examined the bodies, photographed the camp, collected evidence. They found no signs of an outside intruder. No unfamiliar footprints, no foreign DNA, no evidence that anyone else had been at the camp. Eventually, they let us go, told us not to leave town, that they'd be in touch. The news shocked many people when it hit the local media. Martial arts instructor found dead on camping trip. Mystery surrounds deaths of grapplers in forest. The funeral had a massive turnout. Warren had touched many lives, trained dozens of students over the years. I went, though I could barely focus on the service. I kept scanning the crowd, looking for Felix, but I didn't see him. The police were even baffled, according to Detective Garrison when she called me a week later. "None of you had the skill or strength to overpower both victims," she said. "The medical examiner confirms they were strangled with remarkable technique. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." "So what does that mean?" I asked. "It means we're looking into Warren's past, seeing if he had enemies, someone who might have tracked him to that campsite." But I knew she was grasping at straws. There was no mysterious outsider. The killer had been at that camp, sleeping in one of those tents. Before Warren's school closed down permanently, I organized a final open mat session, a memorial roll, we called it. One last chance to train on the mats where Warren had taught us, to honor his memory through the art he'd loved. I sent out messages to every student I could contact. Most people didn't respond. A few sent condolences but said they couldn't make it. Too painful, they said. Too soon. I understood. The school felt haunted now. Every corner held memories of Warren demonstrating a technique, correcting our form, laughing at someone's joke. Walking through those doors felt like visiting a grave. On the day of the memorial roll, I arrived early. The warehouse was cold, the mats empty. I changed into my gi and warmed up alone, drilling movements until my muscles remembered what my mind couldn't focus on. One other person showed up. Just one. Out of all the students Warren had trained over the years. Felix. He walked in wearing his white belt, his gi crisp and clean. He bowed to the mats, then to me. His face showed no emotion. "You came," I said, stating the obvious. "I wanted to pay my respects," Felix said. It was maybe the longest sentence I'd ever heard him speak. We warmed up separately. I kept glancing at him, watching the way he moved. Something about it seemed wrong, too fluid, too confident for someone with only 2 months of training. "Should we roll?" Felix asked after about 10 minutes. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to refuse, to leave, to get away from this person. But I was a purple belt. He was a white belt. I had 3 years of experience on him. What did I have to be afraid of? "Sure," I said. We slapped hands and started. I went easy at first, like you do with beginners. I allowed him to attempt moves, planning to counter gently, to teach rather than dominate. But within 10 seconds I realized something was very wrong. Felix moved like water. When I tried to establish grips, he slipped away. When I attempted to pass his guard, he swept me effortlessly. His weight distribution was perfect, his base unshakable. He wasn't rolling like a white belt. He was rolling like someone with years of high-level experience. Within a minute, he had me mounted. I tried to escape using techniques that had worked against far more experienced opponents. Nothing worked. He predicted every movement, shut down every attempt. Then his hands were on my collar. Not the usual training grip, but something else, something specific. The blood flow to my brain began to restrict. I felt the chokehold sinking in, and a distant part of my mind recognized the technique. It was the same kind of pressure that had killed Warren and Dominic. Expert level, invisible to anyone watching, but devastatingly effective. Felix leaned close to my ear. "You know," he whispered. Just those 2 words. Then he released the choke and stood up, smiling. Not a friendly smile, a satisfied one. I lay on the mat, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt an unusual sense of pressure and technique in that roll. Though he was meant to be a white belt, he'd completely dominated me. Felix bowed to the mats, then walked to the edge to grab his bag. "Thank you for the roll," he said. Without another word, he left the warehouse. I stayed on the mat for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Felix had the skill to kill Warren and Dominic. He'd revealed that skill to me deliberately. Why? To threaten me? To warn me? To tell me that I was alive only because he allowed it? I never saw Felix again after that day. He disappeared completely. No social media presence, no address on file at the school, nothing. It was like he'd never existed. Detective Garrison called me one more time, weeks later. "We've closed the case," she said, her voice heavy with frustration. "No viable suspects, no evidence pointing to any particular individual. Officially, it's unsolved." I almost told her about Felix, about that final role, about the way he'd moved and the words he'd whispered. But what would I say? That a white belt beat me in training? That I had a bad feeling about him? It wasn't evidence. It was just paranoia. Except it wasn't paranoia. I knew. Deep in my bones, in the place where instinct lives, I knew that Felix had killed them both. But proving it was impossible, and part of me didn't want to try. Because if Felix had vanished, then maybe I was safe. Maybe whatever game he'd been playing was over. I eventually joined a new BJJ school across town. I needed to keep training, needed the structure and discipline in my life. But everything had changed. Nowadays, when I spar, especially with white belts, I do so with caution. My instructor at the new school has commented on it. "You're too tense," he says. "You need to relax more." But I can't relax, because rolling with white belts triggers something in me. Stress, panic, an animal awareness that something is wrong, that danger is present even when everything looks safe. None of the white belts I've faced have ever had the same level of skill as Felix. They move like beginners should move, awkward, unsure, learning. But I watch them carefully anyway, studying every grip, every shift in weight, every expression on their faces. What the implications of Felix's skill might be, I don't like to think about. Was he a black belt pretending to be a beginner? Was he some kind of predator who hunted martial artists? Did Warren and Dominic know something about him? Something that got them killed? I'll never know. And maybe that's worse than any answer I could find. I do know that I miss my old instructor and his school. I miss the person I was before that camping trip. Before I learned that monsters are real and they wear white belts and smile at you while they're deciding whether you deserve to live. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Felix will come back. If he'll show up at my new school one day, wearing a white belt again, ready to start training. I wonder what I'll do if that happens. Will I have the courage to expose him? Or will I do what I did before? Nothing. Because the truth is too terrifying to speak aloud. The police may have closed the case, but for me it will never be closed. Every time I step on the mats, I'm back in that forest finding Warren's body. I'm back in that warehouse feeling Felix's hands on my collar, hearing his whisper, "You know." And I do know. I know that somewhere out there Felix is still training, still perfecting his technique, still wearing that white belt like a disguise, still looking for his next victims. I just pray to God that I'm not one of them. Before this, I didn't believe in dogmen or most cryptids beyond Bigfoot, and since I'm in Australia, yowies, but even yowies weren't on my radar. I assumed if they were real, they'd be further north. I live in a heavily forested area in Victoria, near the Yarra Valley. My property backs onto the Yarra Ranges National Park, which is massive if you look it up. My name is David Mitchell. I've lived on this property for 15 years with my daughter Emily, who's now 12. Her mother left when Emily was 4, unable to cope with the isolation of rural life. I chose this place specifically for that isolation. 40 acres of partially cleared land surrounded by dense Australian bush with views of the Yarra Valley and direct access to the national park. I worked from home as a technical writer, which allowed me to balance my career with raising Emily. I've always considered myself a rational person. Sure, I enjoyed the occasional documentary about unexplained phenomena, but I approached them with healthy skepticism. Cryptids were interesting stories, nothing more. If pressed, I might have admitted that something like Bigfoot could potentially exist in the vast unexplored regions of North America, or that yowies might roam the dense forests of Queensland or New South Wales. But here, in Victoria? No way. That certainty began to unravel on a cool autumn evening in April. The day had been unusually warm, and I decided to take a walk around the property before sunset. Emily was at a friend's house for a sleepover, so I had the evening to myself. I followed my usual path, a roughly circular route that took me along the edge of our cleared land before dipping briefly into the forest at the back of the property. The sun was just beginning to set when I reached the forest edge. Long shadows stretched across the ground, and the calls of native birds preparing to roost filled the air. It was peaceful, familiar. I'd walked this same route hundreds of times over the years. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a bright flash above the trees to my right, then another to my left. It felt like something was playing with me. I stopped, confused. The flashes were too bright to be birds or insects, too quick and localized to be lightning. Perhaps someone hiking in the national park with a powerful flashlight. But the angle was wrong. These lights had appeared above the canopy. I looked down, waited, and snapped my head up. And there it was. A huge basketball-sized flash right in front of me. It hovered for a split second, long enough for me to register its perfect spherical shape and brilliant white-blue color before vanishing. I stood frozen, heart racing. I had no clue what it was. Maybe a UFO? I'd never believed in those either, but I couldn't explain what I'd just seen. The forest had gone eerily silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves despite the light breeze I could feel on my skin. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I suddenly felt watched. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing unusual. Still the feeling persisted, a crawling sensation across my skin that made me want to retreat to the safety of my house. Instead, I forced myself to complete my walk, though at a much quicker pace than usual. By the time I reached the house, darkness had fallen completely, and I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the evening researching ball lightning and similar phenomena, but nothing quite matched what I'd seen. The next night, after Emily had returned home and gone to bed, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to return to the same spot, flashlight in hand, to see if the lights would appear again. I told myself I was being scientific, gathering more data to help explain the previous night's anomaly. And before I even got there, I was hit with overwhelming dread. It wasn't just fear. It was primal terror that froze me in place, like someone was coming at me with a knife. My chest tightened, my breath came in short gasps, and my vision narrowed. A voice in my head said, "Run," and I bolted faster than ever. I didn't consciously decide to move. My body simply reacted, propelling me back toward the house at a full sprint. I burst through the back door, slamming it shut and leaning against it, trembling and gasping for breath. I felt sick afterward. My stomach churned, and I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting. Once the nausea passed, I sat on the bathroom floor, trying to make sense of what had happened. I hadn't seen anything threatening, hadn't heard anything unusual, but the feeling, that absolute certainty that I was in mortal danger, had been overwhelming. Sleep eluded me that night. I checked on Emily several times, irrationally afraid that whatever had terrified me in the forest might somehow threaten her. By morning, exhausted and jittery from too much coffee, I'd convinced myself that I must have had some kind of panic attack. Perhaps the stress of work deadlines, single parenthood, and isolation was finally catching up to me. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Something had wanted me to run. Something had warned me away. After that, I needed answers. I started researching local legends, indigenous stories about the area, and reports of unusual phenomena in the Yar Ranges. Most of what I found was fairly benign. Occasional reports of strange lights that were usually attributed to car headlights reflecting off fog, or unusual sounds that could be explained by known animals. But buried in forums and local history books, I found scattered references to hairy men in the mountains, stories that predated European settlement and continued in hushed conversations among longtime residents. I began paying closer attention to my surroundings. I started noticing classic Yowie signs that I'd previously overlooked or dismissed. Stick structures too deliberate to be random. Whooping sounds at dusk that didn't match any known bird call. Loud bipedal footsteps moving through the forest at night. Snapped trees that couldn't have been broken by wind alone. And saplings twisted or jammed into the ground in patterns that seemed to mark territory. The more I noticed, the more frequent the signs became. Or perhaps they had always been there, and I was only now seeing them with new eyes. Either way, I realized they knew I was aware of them. So I started taking pictures of everything. The stick structures, the twisted saplings, the unusual tracks I occasionally found at the forest edge. I compiled them in a folder on my computer, occasionally comparing them to photos on Yowie research websites. The similarities were undeniable, but after a few weeks of documentation, I backed off, worried I'd make them mad. I'd read enough accounts to know that these creatures, if they existed, valued their privacy. The last thing I wanted was to provoke them, especially with Emily in the house. I resolved to be more respectful, to observe without intrusion. I still walked the property but avoided venturing deep into the forest. I stopped taking photographs. I tried to convince myself that I could coexist peacefully with whatever was out there, as long as I kept my distance. That uneasy truce might have held if not for what happened next. It was a clear night in late May when I saw a silent light fly overhead. I was sitting on the back porch, nursing a beer and staring at the stars, when movement caught my eye. At first I thought it was a satellite, a moving point of light traveling steadily across the sky. But as I watched it change direction, making a sharp turn that no satellite or conventional aircraft could manage. It wasn't a plane. No sound, no blinking lights, and it wasn't on any flight path I'd checked. I'd become somewhat obsessed with tracking flight paths after the first strange lights, downloading apps that showed all registered air traffic. This light was something else entirely. The light flew toward the same area where I'd seen the flashes and seemed to land. I watched, transfixed, as it descended slowly into the forest about a kilometer from my property line. It hovered just above the treetops for several minutes, pulsing gently. Then another light joined it, rising from a different part of the forest to meet the first. They circled each other in what almost looked like a dance, before both disappeared simultaneously. That night I heard more strange sounds. A weird owl hoot I'd never heard before, repeated at precise 30-second intervals for nearly an hour. Crackling branches and heavy footsteps moving around the perimeter of my property, and once, a low guttural growl that made my skin crawl. I closed all my blinds, freaking out but trying to remain calm for Emily's sake. She'd noticed my growing anxiety over the past weeks and had started asking questions I couldn't answer. How could I tell my 12-year-old daughter that I suspected we were being watched by creatures that most people believed were myths? The next morning I made a decision. If these Yowies were real, and if they were on or near my property, I needed to establish some kind of peaceful relationship with them. Antagonizing them clearly wasn't an option. They were in their territory long before I arrived. But perhaps there was a way to communicate, to let them know I meant no harm. Wanting to make peace, I read up on Yowies and similar creatures from around the world. Many accounts suggested they were intelligent, curious beings that occasionally interacted with humans in non-threatening ways. Some researchers even claim to have established long-term peaceful relationships with them through respect and regular offerings. So I walked the property, talking out loud and leaving fruit as an offering, which I later learned is a bad idea, apparently. I felt ridiculous at first, speaking to the empty forest as if having a conversation with an invisible friend. I explained that Emily and I meant no harm, that we respected their territory and would keep their presence secret. I left apples, oranges, and bananas at the edge of the forest, placing them carefully on a flat rock that seemed to mark the boundary between my cleared land and their domain. The fruit disappeared overnight. It could have been taken by any number of nocturnal animals I knew, but something about the way it vanished with no scattered cores or peels, no evidence of messy eating suggested something more deliberate. I continued this practice for several days, always speaking aloud before leaving the offerings, always checking the previous day's spot to find it emptied. On the fifth day, as I placed a particularly large apple on the rock, I heard a strange sound from the forest. Not quite a word, not quite a thought, but something in between. "Hello, human." I froze, looking around wildly. There was no one visible, no movement in the trees. The voice hadn't come from outside me, but from within my own mind, a foreign thought that had somehow inserted itself among my own. Something I later found out is called mind speak. I stood perfectly still, heart pounding, trying to decide if I'd imagined it. Then it came again, clearer this time. "We warned you to run." The voice, if you could call it that, was difficult to describe. It wasn't male or female, young or old. It felt ancient and wild, like the forest itself had found a way to communicate. The words weren't heard so much as felt, impressions rather than sounds. "Who are you?" I whispered, feeling both terrified and exhilarated. A series of images flashed through my mind. Tall, hairy figures moving through the forest, a young one climbing a tree with impossible speed, a group gathered around a structure made of broken branches. Then words again. "You know us. Yowie. Old ones." "Did you make the lights?" I asked, my voice shaking. The response came with a sense of negation, followed by a warning feeling. The flashing lights were connected to a creature they called Pigface, I don't know if that's a nickname or if it literally looked like a pig, but it was unsettling. The impression I got was of something different from the Yowies, something they themselves avoided. Pigface comes with lights. Not like us. Dangerous. I wanted to ask more, but the presence in my mind was already fading, like a radio signal growing weaker. I called out again, but received no response. The forest had gone quiet again, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I had a few more vague conversations with the Yowie voice over the following weeks. It wasn't always clear, but I could make sense of it. The communications were brief and often cryptic, composed more of impressions and emotions than actual words. I gathered that there was a small group of them living in the national park, that they had been there for generations, and that they were generally wary of humans but not hostile. They seemed particularly concerned about Pigface and the lights, warning me repeatedly to avoid certain areas of the forest at night. I got the impression that these creatures, or this creature, was a newcomer to the area, and unwelcome from the Yowie's perspective. My encounters remained purely telepathic until one remarkable afternoon in early June. Emily and I were collecting firewood near the edge of our property. The winter chill had set in, and we were stocking up for the season. Emily had wandered a little way into the trees, still within sight but far enough that I called out a warning not to go deeper into the forest. That's when I saw it. A young one that was about 4 feet tall and looked like a gorilla, but with features that were distinctly not ape-like, a flatter face, more human-like eyes, longer limbs. It moved between 2 large eucalyptus trees, watching Emily with what seemed like curiosity. It ran incredibly fast, then turned translucent and vanished. At the same time, my daughter shouted, "Dad, I saw a monkey." She ran back to me, eyes wide with excitement. She described the same thing I had seen. It was like a little gorilla, but it ran so fast. Then it just disappeared. I knelt down to her level. It wasn't a monkey, Em. It was a Yowie. A what? A Yowie. They're like Australian Bigfoot. They live in the forests. Her eyes grew even wider. Real monsters? Not monsters, I corrected quickly. Just different creatures. They're shy and don't want to hurt us. Far from being frightened, Emily was thrilled. She bombarded me with questions about the Yowies, most of which I couldn't answer with any certainty. I told her what I knew, what I'd read, and a little about my own experiences, careful to frame it all in a way that wouldn't frighten her. "Have you seen them before?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "I think they've been watching us for a while. I've been talking to them in a way. Can I talk to them too? Maybe, but they're very shy. We have to be respectful and patient. Since then, I've felt a connection with that young one, though I've only seen it that one time. It's cheeky, and there are too many little stories to tell right now." Emily named it Blink because of the way it had vanished, and she often left small gifts at the edge of the forest, pretty stones, flowers, once a drawing she'd made of what she thought it looked like. Sometimes these gifts would disappear and be replaced with other items, an unusually shaped piece of bark, a perfect feather, once a small carved wooden figure that looked ancient. I never saw these exchanges happen, but Emily was convinced they were from Blink, and I had no reason to doubt her. Our life settled into a new pattern. We talked about the Yowies openly between ourselves, but agreed it would be our secret from the outside world. Emily seemed to adapt to the idea far more easily than I had, accepting the presence of these creatures with the flexible mindset of childhood. For her, they were simply interesting neighbors who happened not to be human. I, on the other hand, still struggled with reconciling their existence with my previously held worldview. If Yowies were real, what else might be out there in the forests and mountains? What other creatures might exist beyond the boundaries of conventional knowledge? I would soon find out, in ways I never could have anticipated. The Dogman encounter started when I noticed strange tracks alongside the Yowie prints. I'd become adept at identifying the latter. Large humanoid footprints with 5 toes but proportioned differently from human feet, with a wider ball and narrower heel. The new tracks were something else entirely. They appeared one morning after a light rain, pressed into the mud at the forest edge. At first glance they resembled dog prints, but they were enormous, easily 8 inches across, and had an unusual structure. The front 2 toes extended further than a normal canid track, and there was something about the depth and spacing that suggested the creature walked upright at least part of the time. Something that looked like a mix between a dog and a kangaroo, but much larger. I photographed them alongside a ruler for scale, then spent hours researching online, trying to identify any known animal that might leave such marks. Nothing matched. I didn't think much of them until one day, while trying to mind speak with the Yowies, I was hit with a horrifying mental image of a deformed dog-like creature. It stood upright on powerful hind legs, its front limbs hanging like arms rather than forelegs. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and something almost human, intelligent eyes set in a long muzzle filled with gleaming teeth. Its body was covered in dark fur, and its proportions were all wrong, too large and too muscular for any canine species I knew. It was a nasty experience. The image came with overwhelming emotions. Fear, warning, danger. I broke off the mental connection immediately, gasping and shaking. It took me several minutes to calm down enough to think rationally again. I looked into it and started researching Dogman. To my surprise, there was a substantial body of literature on these creatures. Less well known than Bigfoot or werewolf legends, but documented across multiple continents and cultures. They were consistently described as upright, wolf-like beings of unusual intelligence and often hostile intent. The accounts varied in detail, but shared common elements. Glowing eyes, usually amber or red, a strong musky odor, the ability to move with supernatural speed, and in some cases apparent telepathic abilities. Many witnesses reported feelings of overwhelming dread before sightings, similar to what I'd experienced on my second night of investigating the lights. That's when I began seeing glowing eyes in the bush and felt this intense hatred directed at me. It started as glimpses, pinpoints of amber light between trees, visible for seconds before blinking out. Maybe the eyes were owls, but the feeling was terrifying. Each sighting came with a wave of malevolence, a sensation of being hunted that made my skin crawl and my heart race. I began limiting my outdoor activities to daylight hours. I installed additional security lights around the property and kept a baseball bat by the door. I worried constantly about Emily, insisting that she stay within sight of the house when playing outside, and making sure all doors and windows were locked at night. When I tried communicating with the Yowies about this, they said one word: wolf. I panicked. The impression that accompanied the word was clear. These wolves were feared even by the Yowies, creatures who seemed to fear very little in the forest. Soon after, I started finding chewed-up dog toys and tennis balls scattered around the property. Despite not owning a dog, maybe it was the Yowies, I don't know. The toys were mangled, punctured by what must have been powerful jaws. The tennis balls were crushed completely, as if something had exerted enormous pressure on them. One day, I swear I heard heavy panting nearby as I was hanging laundry on the line. The sound came from just beyond the tree line, a deep rhythmic breathing that couldn't have come from any small animal. I abandoned the laundry and retreated inside, watching from the window as the branches at the forest edge swayed slightly, though there was no wind. I contacted a Yowie researcher I'd found online, a man named Neil, who had spent decades documenting sightings throughout Australia. I sent him photographs of both sets of tracks and described my experiences, careful to express appropriate skepticism despite my growing certainty. His response came within hours, and we agreed to speak by phone the following day. When we did, his normally enthusiastic voice was somber. "What you're describing," he said after I'd recounted my experiences, "doesn't sound like typical Yowie behavior. The telepathic communication. Yes, that's been reported by reliable witnesses. But the toys, the feeling of malevolence, that's something else. Could it be another type of creature?" I asked. "I've been reading about something called Dogman." There was a long pause. "Dogman sightings are rare in Australia," he finally said. "There have been reports in Queensland and the Northern Territory, but I'm not aware of any confirmed sightings in Victoria. But it's possible. It's not impossible. Look, I've been doing this for 30 years, and there are things in the bush that defy conventional explanation. If what you're experiencing matches Dogman accounts from elsewhere, I wouldn't dismiss it outright." He offered to visit and investigate further, but something held me back from accepting. A warning feeling, an intuition that bringing an outsider into this situation might escalate matters in ways I wasn't prepared to handle. At that point, I was too scared to walk to my car at night. Every noise felt like Dogman lurking. The creak of the house settling, the rustle of possums in the roof, the distant calls of nocturnal birds. I began sleeping poorly, waking at the slightest sound. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and my temper shortened. Emily noticed, asking why I was so jumpy, why I kept checking the locks, why I insisted on driving her to the school bus stop rather than letting her walk the short distance as usual. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full truth. I'd been open about the Yowies because they seemed, if not friendly, at least not actively threatening. This new presence was different. Predatory, hostile, dangerous. I didn't want to terrify her, to make her afraid of the home and land she loved. So I made excuses. I was tired from work. I was worried about feral dogs that had been reported in the area. I was just being extra cautious because of the approaching winter weather. She didn't believe me. I could see the doubt in her eyes, the concern. My 12-year-old was worrying about me, rather than the other way around. It should have been a wake-up call, a reason to get grip on my growing paranoia. Instead, it made me more determined to resolve the situation, to eliminate the threat so we could return to our peaceful coexistence with the forest and its more benign inhabitants. I just didn't know how catastrophically that determination would backfire. The days grew shorter as winter tightened its grip on the Yar Valley. Darkness fell by 5 in the evening, stretching the hours I spent huddled inside, jumping at shadows and straining to identify the sources of sounds from the surrounding forest. Emily had gone to stay with her grandmother in Melbourne for a long weekend, a trip we'd planned months ago for a special exhibition at the Melbourne Museum. I'd considered canceling, even thought about accompanying her, but in the end I decided she should go. My mother-in-law was the only other family we had, and their relationship was important. Besides, part of me felt Emily might be safer away from our property, at least until I figured out what was happening. So I found myself alone on a Friday night. The house eerily quiet without Emily's chatter and movement. I tried to work, to lose myself in technical documentation, but couldn't focus. Every few minutes my eyes would drift to the windows, expecting to see those amber pinpoints staring back at me. I made a simple dinner, more out of obligation than hunger, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, back to the wall where I could see both the front and back doors. Afterward, exhausted from weeks of poor sleep and constant vigilance, I decided to go to bed early. Then one night I made the mistake of leaving my bedroom blinds open. My bedroom faced the back of the property, with a large window overlooking the yard and the forest beyond. I usually kept the blinds tightly closed after dark, but that night, I'd been distracted by a phone call from Emily, excited about her day at the museum. Afterward, I'd fallen into bed without completing my usual security routine. I woke suddenly, unsure what had disturbed me. The digital clock on my bedside table read 2:17 a.m. The room was bathed in pale moonlight, and for a moment I lay still, blinking up at the ceiling, trying to identify what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound outside my window. I turned my head slowly, and I saw it, a massive beast right next to my window. I only got a glimpse of black fur about 2-3 inches long, and part of its skin. Even in the moonlight I could make out the texture, unlike anything I'd seen, like monstrous detailed armor, scales or plates beneath the fur that shifted as the creature moved. Its face was partially obscured by the window frame, but I could see one eye, large, reflective, a deep amber that seemed to glow from within. The eye was fixed on me, unblinking, intelligent. There was recognition in that gaze, awareness. This wasn't an animal looking at me, it was a being, something that understood exactly what it was seeing and why it was there. I looked away quickly, remembering advice not to make eye contact with predators. I was paralyzed with fear, my breath frozen in my lungs, my body rigid beneath the covers. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, but I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The scraping sound came again, claws against the wooden siding of the house. Then a low rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the glass and into my bones. The creature shifted, and I caught another glimpse from the corner of my eye. Massive shoulders, easily a meter wide, covered in the same dark fur. It was huge, far larger than any dog or wolf I'd ever seen or imagined. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the creature remained at my window, watching. I kept my eyes averted, my body still, afraid that any movement might provoke an attack. Finally, there was a soft thud, as if the creature had dropped to all fours, and the sound of heavy footsteps retreating across the yard. I lay frozen for at least another hour, afraid to move, afraid to look toward the window again. When I finally gathered the courage to rise, legs shaking and heart pounding, I approached the window cautiously and closed the blinds before turning on the light. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, the baseball bat across my knees, until dawn broke. When daylight finally came, I ventured outside to look for tracks or other evidence of the night visitor. There were deep gouges in the wooden siding beneath my window, as if something with powerful claws had gripped the house itself. The ground below showed large canine-like prints, the same ones I'd been finding on the property for weeks, but fresher and more defined. They led from the forest directly to my window, then circled the house completely before returning to the trees. It had been patrolling, I realized with a chill. Examining our home, learning our habits, perhaps looking for weaknesses in our defenses. A few days later, driven by a desperate hope that I might somehow appease the creature, I left some meat bones out as an offering and apologized aloud, hoping to end the ordeal. I placed the bones at the forest edge, far enough from the house that I wouldn't attract the creature closer, but visible enough that it would find them. The bones disappeared overnight. In their place was a small, twisted piece of metal. I later realized it was the collar tag from a domestic dog. The name and contact information scratched away completely. A message, perhaps? A warning? I couldn't be sure, but the implication was disturbing. Soon after, I had another telepathic interaction. This one clear and direct, unlike the Yowie mind speak. It came as I was checking the windows before bed, 2 nights after leaving the bones. The pressure in my head was sudden and intense, like a migraine exploding behind my eyes. I staggered, gripping the kitchen counter to stay upright as words formed in my mind. It was from the dog man, or rather a dog woman. The voice was unmistakably female. Deep but with a feminine quality, resonant with power and age. Human. The word alone carried weight, pressing against my consciousness like a physical force. You are in my territory. I tried to respond mentally, to explain that I had lived here for years, that I meant no harm, but the pressure increased, cutting off my attempts at communication. You have found my den. I have pups. You will stay away. An image flashed in my mind, a hollow beneath a rocky outcropping, lined with dry leaves and fur. Inside, 3 small forms huddled together, their eyes closed, their bodies covered in fine dark fuzz. Puppies, but not like any I'd ever seen. Even in this infant stage, there was something wrong about their proportions, something that hinted at the monstrous form they would grow into. She told me I had found her den. She had pups, and she was furious. Another image followed. Me walking through the forest months earlier, passing unknowingly close to the den site. I had been documenting Yowie signs, taking photographs, unaware that I was being watched by eyes far more dangerous than those of the forest giants. She gave me an ultimatum. If I ever revealed their location, she would kill my daughter. The mental image that accompanied this threat was graphic and horrifying. Emily's small body broken and bloodied. The telepathic pressure was like a vice on my head, squeezing until I could barely think through the pain. I was furious, outraged, conflicted, asked for other ways but had no choice. I projected thoughts of protest, of defiance, but they dissolved against the implacable wall of her will. She was stronger than me in this realm of mind-to-mind communication. Far stronger. I could feel her rifling through my thoughts, examining my memories, learning everything about Emily and me. The pressure was too much, and only when I realized that I had no choice, I agreed. I would keep their existence secret. I would stay away from the den. I would ensure no one else ventured near it. The pressure vanished immediately, leaving me gasping and trembling, tears streaming down my face from the pain. I still feel ashamed by this, but strangely, I trusted her. She was protecting her young. In a way, she was pleading with me. Beneath the threats and the display of power, there was the desperate concern of a mother, the primal need to protect vulnerable offspring. It was a feeling I understood all too well. I kept my daughter close by me, though. When Emily returned from Melbourne, I rarely let her out of my sight. I drove her to and from the bus stop every day. I invented reasons why certain parts of our property were off limits. I installed a home security system with cameras covering every approach to the house. Emily chafed against these new restrictions, confused and frustrated by my overprotective behavior. I couldn't explain the real reason, couldn't tell her about the dog woman's threat, so our relationship suffered. We argued more frequently, her preteen independence clashing with my newfound paranoia. But I would accept her anger, her resentment, if it meant keeping her safe. The image the dog woman had planted in my mind, Emily, broken and dead, haunted my nightmares. I would do anything to prevent it from becoming reality. After that, I had a few more interactions with her via telepathy, I believe it was, so she could read my mind to see if I kept my promise. The first came about a week after our initial contact. Another sudden pressure in my head that arrived without warning as I was chopping firewood in the yard. Human, you have kept your word. It wasn't a question, but a statement. I could feel her presence sifting through my recent memories, checking to see if I'd spoken to anyone about her or the den, if I'd returned to the area where we'd had our first encounter. Yes, I responded mentally, having learned somewhat how to project my thoughts in a way she could receive them. I promised. The small one asks questions. She meant Emily, I realized with a jolt of fear. Had she been watching us that closely? I haven't told her about you, I assured quickly. She knows about the Yowies, but not about your kind. There was a sensation like a grunt of acknowledgement. Neither approval nor disapproval, simply acceptance of the fact. The fur people are no threat to my pups. You are. The fur people, that must be what she called the Yowies. The distinction was interesting, suggesting a relationship or at least awareness between the two species that I hadn't considered. I'm not a threat, I projected, trying to convey sincerity. I just want to live peacefully. This is my home too. The pressure increased slightly, a reminder of her power. Your home is new. We have been here always. I didn't argue. What were my 15 years compared to what might be generations or centuries of habitation? Instead, I asked a question. Are there more like you? The pressure withdrew slightly, as if she was considering whether to answer. When it returned, it came with a complex mix of emotions. Wariness, territorial defensiveness, but also something like loneliness. Not here. Others far. We are few. Before I could ask more, the connection broke, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the half-chopped pile of wood. She was cagey, and I got zero information on Dogman. I believe she and her family have moved on. Our mental contacts became less frequent over the following weeks. Each time she seemed to be checking that I had maintained my silence, that I posed no threat to her or her pups. I never initiated these communications. I wouldn't have known how, but I came to anticipate them, to recognize the distinctive pressure in my head that signaled her presence. The last contact came in late July, nearly 2 months after our first encounter. It was briefer than the others, just a touch of her consciousness against mine, and a few clear impressions rather than words. Her pups, larger now, and more active, a journey, a new territory, a farewell that wasn't exactly gratitude but acknowledged our pact had been kept. I understood she was leaving, moving her family to a more remote area, perhaps deeper into the national park or beyond. The relief I felt was tempered by an odd sense of loss. Our relationship had been built on fear and threat, yet there had been something intimate about it too, a connection that transcended ordinary human experience. Since then, I've felt more at ease in the bush. I walk with respect, staying mindful of where not to go. I still avoid the area where I believe her den was located, though I'm fairly certain it's empty now. Old habits and old promises die hard. The Yowies still seem active occasionally. I've seen red-eye shine and heard strange crashing sounds, tree breaks, tree twists, etc. But I believe the original ones I communicated with have left for winter and might return in summer. Our interactions have become less frequent but more comfortable, a peaceful coexistence based on mutual respect and territory. Emily noticed the change in me, the lifting of the oppressive fear that had gripped me for months. Our relationship began to heal as I relaxed the strict rules I'd imposed, allowing her more freedom to explore the property again. I still keep her away from certain areas, still maintain some precautions, but the desperate terror has subsided. I haven't told her about the dog woman or her pups. Perhaps someday, when she's older, I might share that part of our story. For now, she's content with the Yowies, leaving occasional gifts for Blink, and making up stories about their society and customs that might be more accurate than she realizes. Sometimes at night I still hear unusual sounds from the forest, howls that don't quite match any known animal. Heavy footsteps moving with purpose through the underbrush. The forest has changed for me, transformed from a familiar backdrop to my life into a realm of mystery and possibility. I can never return to my former skepticism, my comfortable certainty that the world is fully known and catalogued. I know better now. There are shadows in the Yar ranges, beings that exist at the edges of human awareness, intelligence and awareness in forms we've relegated to myth and legend. They were here before us, and they'll likely remain long after we're gone. So, what do you think? Was it really a dog man? Or was a Yowie messing with me? Or something else? Was Pigface a dog man? The big difference I noticed was in how they communicated. To me, Yowie mind-speak feels broken and vague, while Dogman telepathy was sharp and intrusive. I even think Dogman could read my mind. Sometimes in my darkest moments I wonder if any of it was real. If perhaps stress or isolation or some undiagnosed condition caused me to hallucinate, to build an elaborate mythology around natural phenomena and ordinary wildlife. It would be easier in many ways to believe that, to return to a world where the boundaries between known and unknown are clearly marked. But then I look at the photographs I've taken, the twisted saplings and inexplicable structures. I remember the feeling of those alien minds touching mine, so distinct and different from each other that I couldn't possibly have invented both. I recall the collar tag left in place of the bones, the claw marks on my house that no native animal could have made. And I know this is real. They are real. I live differently now, more cautiously, more respectfully, but also more aware of the wonder that surrounds us. The forest is not just trees and animals and geological features. It's a complex ecosystem of intelligences, some similar to ours, some profoundly different. We've forgotten this, most of us, wrapped in our technological cocoons and urban certainties. But here, on the edge of the Yar Ranges with the vast national parks stretching into the distance, it's impossible to maintain that comfortable ignorance. They're out there, watching, living their own lives parallel to ours, occasionally intersecting in ways that challenge everything we think we know. And somewhere deeper in the mountains perhaps, a dog woman raises her pups, teaching them to hunt, to survive, to avoid humans when possible, and dominate them when necessary. I hope our paths never cross again. But if they do, I'll remember our agreement, and I'll keep my promise. Some secrets are worth keeping, even from those we love most. The forest keeps its mysteries close. I've been privileged or cursed to glimpse a few of them. That knowledge can never be unlearned. The veil never replaced. All I can do now is live with this new awareness, this expanded understanding of what the world contains, and wonder, always, what else might be out there, watching from the shadows. I started working as a park ranger because I loved solitude, but now I realize I'm never truly alone out here. My name is Roger McAllister, and this happened to me back in 2017, in the Custer-Gallatin National Forest in Montana, when I was still getting the hang of working as a junior ranger, after spending most of my 20s as a small-time handyman in Bozeman, trying to impress my new boss with my punctuality and my so-called dedication to the craft, which really just meant showing up on time, staying awake during patrols, and not messing up the coffee order at the ranger station. The woods had always been my sanctuary. As a kid, I'd escape to the forests around Bozeman whenever my father's drinking got too loud, whenever the walls of our cramped house seemed to close in like a fist. The trees didn't judge. They didn't shout. They just stood there, ancient and patient, offering their silence like a gift. That's what drew me to this job, the promise of endless quiet, of days spent walking among giants that had seen centuries pass without complaint. But silence, I was learning, could be deceiving. Sometimes it wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something holding its breath. I remember it was around late May, and the snowmelt had made the forest floor spongy beneath my boots. It smelled like wet bark and old leaves in the mornings, and by noon the scent shifted to fresh pine sap and that faint whiff of campfire smoke from visitors who never quite followed the rules about extinguishing their flames. The ground squelched with each step, releasing the sweet sick smell of decomposition from last year's fallen leaves. Everything was awakening from winter's grip. And with that awakening came sounds I hadn't learned to identify yet, the crack of settling ice, the distant howl of wind through limestone caves, and sometimes, just sometimes, something that sounded almost like breathing. I usually tried to forgive the rule breakers. I had grown up respecting the outdoors, so I figured maybe they just needed a gentle reminder. But there were signs that some visitors weren't just careless, they were afraid. I'd find campsites abandoned mid-meal, food still warm over dying coals, sleeping bags left behind like their owners had fled in the night. When I radioed Hector about it, he'd just grunt and say city folks spooked easy. But I was starting to wonder if there was something else out there, something that made even seasoned hikers pack up and run. My boss, Hector Sanchez, a gruff man with a booming laugh who told everyone he'd wrestled a bighorn sheep in his youth, said the forest had its moods. He'd been working these woods for 15 years, and his weathered hands bore the scars of countless encounters with thorns, rocks, and the occasional angry wildlife. But sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, I'd catch him staring into the tree line with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but a kind of watchful respect that went deeper than his usual ranger caution. The other rangers had their own superstitions. Judy, who'd been here almost as long as Hector, never patrolled alone after sunset. She claimed it was policy, but I'd seen her flinch at shadows during daylight hours. And there was something about the way conversations died when certain areas of the forest came up in discussion. The northeastern perimeter, the old mining trails, the sections where the radio signals got spotty and compasses spun like drunken dancers. I started that particular shift with a bacon sandwich in the patrol truck just after sunrise. The sky was pale blue, the kind of color that promises a bright day. I had a thermos of weak coffee I'd made myself, which tasted like something strained through my old socks, but I drank it anyway. The radio crackled with Hector's voice doing his morning roll call, checking in with each ranger as we scattered to our assigned sectors. McAllister, you copy. Copy, Hector. Take the northeastern perimeter today. Old trailhead near Devil's Backbone. There was a pause, and I thought I heard him take a deep breath. Keep your radio on and check in every hour. And Roger? Yeah? Trust your instincts out there. It was an odd thing to say. Trust your instincts about what? Bears? Weather? But Hector had already moved on to the next ranger, and I was left staring at the tree line, wondering what exactly I was supposed to be watching for. The drive to the northeastern sector took me through some of the most remote areas of the forest. The dirt road wound between massive pines and granite outcroppings, occasionally crossing streams that ran dark with tannins from decomposing leaves. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to press in around me. The morning bird songs that had accompanied me from the station grew sparse, then disappeared entirely. Even the insects fell silent. By the time I reached the old trailhead, the only sound was the idle of my truck's engine and the whisper of wind through pine needles. I parked near a weathered sign that marked the beginning of the Devil's Backbone Trail, a name that had always struck me as unnecessarily ominous. Local legend said it got the name from the jagged ridge that ran along the trail, but older residents sometimes hinted at darker origins. I stepped out of the truck and was immediately struck by how still everything was. Not peaceful still, watchful still, the kind of quiet that made you want to whisper, as if speaking normally might wake something better left sleeping. I adjusted my equipment belt, bear spray, radio, first aid kit, and the service pistol I'd never had to draw in anger. The weight of it against my hip was usually comforting, but today it felt inadequate, like bringing a flashlight to face an eclipse. My route took me to a section of forest where the trail forked near a cluster of granite boulders. These stones were old, older than the trees around them, covered in lichen that looked like ancient writing. Some of the rocks bore scratches, deep gouges that Hector said came from bears marking territory. But as I examined them more closely, I noticed the scratches were too regular, too purposeful. They looked almost like tally marks, as if something had been keeping count. This part of the park was quiet that morning. No sign of hikers yet. The trail showed recent use. Boot prints in the soft earth, candy wrappers caught on low branches, the usual debris of human passage. But there were other signs too. Things I was only beginning to recognize. Broken branches at shoulder height, as if something tall had pushed through the undergrowth. Patches where the pine needles had been disturbed in strange patterns, almost like nests or resting places. I passed a few empty campsites, just patches of flattened pine needles and the lingering stink of burnt marshmallows. But even these abandoned spots felt wrong somehow. The fire rings were too carefully dismantled, the tent stakes pulled up and arranged in neat piles. It was as if the campers hadn't just left. They'd been told to leave, and had obeyed with the kind of urgent precision that comes from genuine fear. Everything felt normal until mid-morning. when I noticed a distant shout echoing through the trees. It sounded like someone calling for help, not a casual hey, more like a panicked bark of terror. The sound bounced between the trees, distorted and multiplied until I couldn't tell which direction it came from. But there was something wrong with the echo. It lasted too long, as if the forest itself was reluctant to let the sound die. I tried to pinpoint the direction, trudging through undergrowth, careful not to slip on damp moss. The ground beneath the pine needles was treacherous, soft in some places, rocky in others, with hidden roots that caught at my boots like grasping fingers. I kept one hand near my belt, where I carried the bear spray and whistle. The pistol bumped against my hip with each step, a constant reminder that I was walking into something I might not be prepared for. As I pushed deeper into the forest, following what I hoped was the direction of the scream, I noticed other things. Trees with bark stripped away in long vertical lines, broken branches hanging at odd angles, as if something had passed through without caring about the damage it left behind. And there was a smell. Not the clean pine scent I was used to, but something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. I reached a small clearing and noticed something off. A tent in the distance collapsed and torn. Its bright red fabric was shredded as if by something powerful. Not the careful tears of a knife or the random damage of wind, but deliberate systematic destruction. The nylon hung in ribbons, fluttering in the barely there breeze like prayer flags in hell. I slowed down, every instinct telling me to turn around and radio for backup. Maybe a black bear had wandered through, got spooked and swiped at it. But even as I tried to convince myself of this rational explanation, I knew it wasn't right. Bears didn't destroy campsites like this. They rummaged for food, made a mess, and moved on. This looked like rage. I approached quietly, calling out, "Hello, Ranger Service. Anybody here?" My voice sounded thin and small in the vast silence of the forest. The silence that followed pressed against my ears like water, dense and suffocating. Then I heard it, a low sound barely audible, like wind moving through a cave. But there was no wind, and there were no caves nearby. Then I saw the first body. A young man in hiking boots lay face down, arms spread awkwardly like he'd tried to crawl away from something. His jacket was ripped open, and there was blood on the leaves beneath him. Not the bright red of a fresh wound, but the dark brown of blood that had been seeping into the earth for hours. His backpack was torn apart, contents scattered across the clearing like an explosion of gear and personal belongings. I froze. I'm not ashamed to admit, I felt my knees shake. I'd never seen a body like that before. Never seen the way death made a person look so small and wrong. My stomach churned, and I took a shaky breath, fighting the urge to vomit. The smell hit me then. The metallic tang of blood mixed with something else, something wild and predatory that made my hindbrain scream warnings. But it was the position of the body that really disturbed me. The young man was facing away from the tent, arms stretched toward the tree line as if he'd been running from his own campsite. Whatever had done this, he'd seen it coming and tried to escape. The thought of his final moments, the terror, the desperate attempt to flee, made my hands shake as I reached for my radio. "Hector, this is Roger. I found a casualty, maybe an animal attack." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor in it. Northeast sector, about half a mile from the old trailhead. Static crackled for a moment before Hector's voice came through, sharp with concern. "Roger, what's your 20? Are you safe?" I think so. But Hector, this is bad. Really bad." He cursed softly and said he'd send help. He told me to stay alert and not do anything reckless. Reckless was how he thought I'd handle stress, I guess. But looking at the destroyed campsite, at the torn fabric and scattered gear, I wondered what reckless even meant in a situation like this. I didn't want to leave the scene. Maybe there were survivors, people hiding in the woods, wounded and waiting for help. So I moved slowly around the campsite, fighting every instinct that told me to run. The tent had been home to at least 3 people. I could see sleeping bags and personal belongings for a small group. Where were the others? I found the second victim behind a fallen log, partially hidden by the massive trunk. A woman this time, mid-20s, wearing trail running shoes and a green beanie. She was still warm when I touched her wrist, checking for a pulse I already knew wouldn't be there. The warmth was the worst part. The suggestion that I'd just missed her, that maybe if I'd arrived an hour earlier, I could have helped. But as I examined her more closely, I realized no amount of help would have made a difference. Her injuries were extensive, brutal. Whatever had done this possessed strength far beyond any human, and a kind of methodical viciousness that spoke of intelligence. This wasn't the random violence of a panicked animal. This was something that knew exactly what it was doing. I kept thinking, what could have done this? A bear. A cougar. But the wounds looked strange. The clothing was torn in oddly precise patterns, like something had enormous claws placed at unusual angles. And there were other marks. Not just claw marks, but what looked almost like bite impressions, though no animal I knew had teeth quite that shape. As I circled back toward the tent, I heard a rustle behind me. Every hair on my body stood up as I whipped around, hand instinctively moving to my sidearm. Something moved between two tall pines, something large and dark. I caught only a glimpse of a broad back covered with coarse dark hair. It seemed taller than any black bear I'd seen in these parts, and its shoulders looked oddly squared, not sloping like a bear's should be. But it was the way it moved that really disturbed me. Too fluid, too purposeful. It didn't lumber or shamble like a bear. It flowed between the trees like dark water, silent and deliberate. Before I could get a better look, it vanished behind a thicket, leaving nothing but swaying branches to mark its passage. I felt the hairs on my neck prickle. There was no roar, no snapping of twigs that I'd associate with a rampaging animal, just quick fluid movement, then a silence so complete it seemed to muffle even my own breathing. Whatever I'd seen, it knew I was there. It had been watching me examine the bodies, watching me piece together what had happened, and now it knew that I knew. I backed away from the campsite, deciding I should maintain a safe perimeter until backup arrived. But safe felt like a relative term now. The forest around me seemed different than it had that morning. The shadows deeper, the spaces between trees somehow larger and more threatening. Every bush could hide a predator, every fallen log could conceal an ambush. As I stepped onto the main trail, trying to put some distance between myself and the carnage, I met a hiker coming from the opposite direction. He was moving fast, practically jogging despite the rough terrain, and when he saw me, his relief was palpable. He was an older man, maybe 60, with the kind of expensive hiking gear that marked him as a serious outdoorsman, but his face was pale, and his hands shook as he approached. "Thank God," he said, breathing hard. "Are you the ranger? There's something wrong in these woods. Something really wrong." "I'm Roger McAllister," I said, showing him my badge. "What's your name?" "Bill. Bill Henderson. I've been hiking these trails for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this." He looked past me toward the destroyed campsite, and his face went even paler. "There's been an incident," I said carefully. "What did you see?" Bill ran a hand through his thinning hair, trying to organize his thoughts. "I was on the western approach trail, about a mile from here. Heard screaming, terrible screaming, like someone being torn apart. Then I saw." He paused, looking embarrassed. "You're going to think I'm crazy. Try me." I saw something running through the trees. Something big and dark. But it was running on 2 legs. Not like a person, though. More like it was comfortable on either 2 legs or 4, switching back and forth as the terrain demanded. He looked at me, expecting me to dismiss him as a confused tourist. "It was fast, Ranger. Faster than anything that size should be able to move." I nodded, thinking of the shape I'd glimpsed between the pines. "Did you get a good look at it?" "Not really. It stayed in the shadows, like it knew I was watching. But the way it moved," he shuddered. "It was hunting something, or someone." We both stood there for a moment, scanning the tree line. The forest seemed to be listening to our conversation, holding its breath to hear what we'd figured out. I tried to lighten the mood with a joke about missing my old handyman job, where the scariest thing I'd encounter was a mouse in someone's garage. My voice came out weak and forced, but Bill managed a nervous chuckle. Humor felt thin out here, inadequate, but it was better than giving in to the panic that scratched at the edges of my mind. About 20 minutes later, I heard Hector on the radio saying that he and Judy were on their way with medical supplies and the deputy sheriff. The cavalry was coming, but I wondered if it would be enough. Whatever we were dealing with had killed 3 people with apparent ease. What could a handful of rangers and 1 deputy do against something like that? I told Bill to stay close to me. He nodded, grateful not to be alone. For a moment I thought maybe we'd be fine if we just stood there and waited for backup. But then we heard it. a frantic noise coming from the slope behind us. Twigs breaking and leaves rustling as something large moved through the undergrowth. Bill spun around and pointed toward the tree line. "There," he whispered. "Do you see it?" We both saw something move, a shape bounding through the undergrowth with unbelievable speed, weaving between trees as if it knew every inch of this forest by heart. It was too far away to make out details, but its size and the way it moved confirmed what I'd hoped was just my imagination running wild. This was real, this was here, and it was still hunting. I tried to follow it with my eyes, but it darted away too quickly, disappearing into a section of dense forest where the trees grew so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a flash of metal on the ground nearby. Someone's dropped flashlight. Its lens cracked and housing dented as if it had been thrown or dropped during a desperate flight. But it was still warm. Whoever had dropped it had been here recently, maybe within the last hour, which meant there might be more victims out there. People who had escaped the initial attack but were now lost in the woods, injured and vulnerable. "We need to get to the main road," I told Bill. "Away from the trees." We started walking, careful and slow, every sense straining for signs of danger. My heart hammered against my ribs and my shirt stuck to my back with nervous sweat. I could smell my own fear, sharp and acidic, the kind of scent that probably attracted predators. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd come to the forest seeking solitude, and now that very isolation might be what killed us. We moved about 50 yards when we spotted another body slumped against a birch tree. This one looked older, maybe a seasoned camper in his 50s. He wore a camouflage vest and carried a folding knife still clenched in his hand, blade extended as if he'd tried to defend himself. It hadn't helped him. The sight of his vacant stare, eyes wide with the terror of his final moments, turned my stomach. Bill looked ready to vomit, and I told him to breathe. Just breathe. But I was struggling with the same nausea, the same sense of unreality. This was supposed to be a routine patrol, a quiet morning in the woods. Instead, I was standing in what looked like a war zone, counting bodies and trying not to think about what kind of creature could do this much damage. At that moment, something heavy shifted on a branch directly above us. We both jerked our heads up, and there it was. The creature crouched in the canopy about 15 feet above our heads, partially hidden by leaves but unmistakably present. It was larger than a man, but it moved with a liquid grace that was completely unnatural. Its legs seemed oddly jointed, as if they could bend in directions human legs couldn't. Its torso was thick and powerful, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the dappled sunlight. But it was the arms that really disturbed me. They were longer than a human's should be, reaching nearly to where its ankles would be if it were standing upright. Its face was the worst part. I could see it clearly through gaps in the foliage, and it was neither fully human nor fully animal. The features were flattened, almost ape-like, but there was an intelligence in its small dark eyes that was purely predatory. It watched us with the patient interest of something that knew it could take us whenever it chose, something that was merely deciding whether we were worth the effort. The strangest part was how quiet it was. The branch bent slightly under its considerable weight, but it made no other sound, no heavy breathing, no growling, none of the noise you'd expect from a large predator. It was like watching a nightmare given form, something that existed in defiance of natural law. I reached for my sidearm, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I was a ranger, not a soldier or a hunter. My training told me to identify threats before firing, but this thing had already killed at least 3 people, and Bill and I were clearly next on its list. As I tried to steady my aim, fighting against my trembling hands and the surreal nature of what I was trying to shoot, it leaped down in a swift motion. But not toward us. Away. It dropped from the branch and bounded into the deeper forest with that same impossible fluidity, disappearing between the trees as if it had never been there at all. Bill and I stood frozen for several seconds, both of us staring at the empty branch, wondering if we'd hallucinated the entire encounter. "What the hell was that?" Bill whispered. I didn't have an answer. In all my training, in all the ranger manuals and wildlife guides, there was nothing that matched what we'd just seen. It was like something from a fever dream, a creature that existed in the space between human imagination and animal reality. We backed away from the trees, putting as much distance as possible between us and whatever was watching us from the shadows. I didn't want to run and trigger a chase response, but I also didn't want to stand still and give it time to circle around behind us. The forest felt alive now, full of hidden eyes and barely contained violence. We managed to find the rough trail that led down toward the dirt service road. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature following us, but the woods remained still. Bill stayed close, whispering that he wanted to get out, that this was too much for him to handle. I tried to joke again, saying something about never complaining about a broken coffee machine at the station again. My laugh sounded hollow and desperate even to my own ears. As we approached the dirt road, I spotted Hector's pickup truck with the Park Service SUV behind it. Judy stood beside Hector, both holding radios and looking tense. When they saw us emerge from the tree line, Judy rushed forward, relief evident on her face. "Roger, thank God. We heard your radio call, and," she stopped, taking in our appearance. Bill and I must have looked like hell, pale, shaking, our clothes disheveled from pushing through the undergrowth. "What happened up there?" I told Hector everything we'd seen. The victims, the strange creature, its speed and silence, the way it watched us from the trees. I expected skepticism, maybe even gentle mockery about rookie rangers seeing things in the shadows. Instead, Hector just nodded grimly, as if this confirmed something he'd been dreading. "How many bodies?" he asked. "3 that I found. There might be more." Judy's face went pale.
3? Jesus, Roger, what could do that?
"I don't know," I admitted. "Something I've never seen before. Something that shouldn't exist." The deputy sheriff arrived 20 minutes later. A tall woman named Carol with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of steady demeanor that suggested she'd seen her share of ugly situations. She listened to our account without interruption, asking only a few clarifying questions. When we finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I'll need you to lead us back to the campsite," she said finally. "All of us. We go in together, we stay together, and nobody wanders off." The idea of returning to that place terrified me, but I nodded. Bill wanted to leave, to get in his car and drive back to whatever city he'd come from, but Carol asked him to come along as a witness. He reluctantly agreed, though I could see the fear in his eyes. Hector and Judy followed us with rifles, not the usual tranquilizer guns rangers carried, but actual firearms loaded with ammunition designed to stop large predators. I carried my handgun, though it felt like a toy compared to what we'd seen. We moved in a tight group, constantly scanning the trees around us. The walk back seemed to take forever. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every rustling leaf could signal an attack. But the forest was eerily quiet, as if all the normal wildlife had fled the area. Even the insects were silent, creating a vacuum of sound that made our footsteps seem unnaturally loud. When we reached the campsite, Carol examined the scene with professional detachment. She took photographs, measured distances, and radioed for additional backup from the county. The bodies were wrapped and removed, the evidence cataloged and bagged. Through it all, she maintained a careful neutrality, neither confirming nor denying what we'd told her about the creature. But I noticed things she probably didn't think I'd see. The way she lingered over the claw marks on nearby trees, measuring them with a ruler and frowning at the results. The careful attention she paid to the footprints we'd found. Prints that were almost human but too large, with claw marks extending beyond where toes should end. The way she looked up into the canopy, as if she too sensed something watching us from above. As the afternoon wore on, and more officials arrived, I found myself studying the scene with new eyes. The scratches on tree bark at shoulder height that I'd attributed to bears were too regular, too purposeful. The broken branches formed a clear path through the forest, as if something large had repeatedly used the same route, and the smell, that organic predatory scent, lingered in certain areas, stronger near what looked like resting places or dens. Bill gave his statement to Carol and the other deputies, describing the creature he'd seen with increasing confidence. Other hikers who'd been in the area over the past few weeks were interviewed, and a pattern began to emerge. Strange sightings, abandoned campsites, the sense of being watched from the forest. What we'd experienced wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of something that had been building for weeks, maybe months. By dusk, we had a small crowd of official vehicles at the edge of the forest. Search teams were being organized. Wildlife experts consulted, and theories debated. Carol told us that until they understood what they were dealing with, nobody should patrol alone. Rangers would work in pairs, carry firearms, and maintain constant radio contact. I felt a surge of relief mixed with something else, a nagging certainty that whatever was out there wasn't going to be found by search teams or stopped by conventional means. It was too smart, too well adapted to this environment. It had been living in these woods for who knows how long, learning human patterns, understanding our weaknesses. We were the visitors here. It was home. That night, Hector dropped me off at my cabin near the station. I sat at my small kitchen table with the overhead light humming quietly, trying to process what had happened. I could still smell the forest on my clothes, still see the creature's eyes watching us from the canopy. I tried eating a sandwich, but it tasted like cardboard. Everything felt wrong, artificial, like I was playing at being normal, while something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of the world. I didn't sleep well. Every small noise outside made me flinch. The settling of the cabin, the whisper of wind through trees, the distant call of an owl. My dreams were tangled masses of twisted branches, silent shapes gliding between trunks, and eyes watching from above. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I was back in the clearing, examining the bodies, when I realized the creature was standing right behind me, breathing softly on the back of my neck. When I woke before dawn, I found myself standing at the window, staring out at the tree line. The forest looked different now. Not peaceful and welcoming, but full of hidden dangers and watching eyes. I understood finally why the other rangers had their superstitions, why certain areas of the forest made them nervous. They'd sensed what I was only now beginning to comprehend. We weren't alone out here, and we never had been. The official investigation continued for weeks. Wildlife experts examined the evidence. Theories were proposed and discarded, and eventually the case was quietly filed away as an unusual but explainable animal attack. A large bear, they said, possibly rabid or defending cubs. The wounds were consistent with ursine claws, the behavior explained by territorial aggression. But I know what we saw. I know what's still out there. I continue to patrol these woods, though never alone now. The forest remains quiet on most days, and tourists come and go, snapping photos and laughing around campfires. I do my job with a forced grin, checking permits and reminding people to store their food properly. But sometimes, just before dark, I catch myself looking over my shoulder. Sometimes I find campsites abandoned for no obvious reason, or discover scratches on trees that are too regular to be random. The creature is still there. I can feel it watching, waiting, learning. It understands now that we know about it, and it's become more careful, more selective. The killings have stopped, but not because it's gone. It's just being more patient. I think about those victims often. The young man who died trying to run, the woman in the green beanie, the older camper who tried to fight back with nothing but a folding knife. I remember the terror in their final moments, the realization that all their human knowledge and technology meant nothing against something that existed outside the boundaries of our civilized world. And sometimes, on the clearest nights when the moon is full and the forest is bathed in silver light, I see a shape moving between the distant trees, too tall to be human, too fluid to be any animal I recognize. It watches the ranger station from the edge of the woods, patient and eternal, reminding me that this is its domain. We are only visitors here, tolerated for now, but always observed. I started working as a park ranger because I loved solitude. Now I understand that solitude was always an illusion. The forest has had a resident far longer than any of us imagined, something that remembers when these woods were truly wild, before trails and campsites and ranger stations carved up its territory. It's still here, still watching, still waiting. And every time I walk these trails, I wonder if today will be the day it decides our temporary truce has lasted long enough.